Our Warriors hashtag is Community Creates Change. Yasmin Vafa joins us today because she is doing exactly this, and she's a return visitor to the Warriors, and we haven't really caught up with her in quite a little bit, and I'm very anxious to talk to Yasmin and talk about a couple of specific things that have come up recently with the landscape of trafficking, incarceration. Well, we're going to save that. I have a lot of things to ask Yasmin, but let's first give you a little tidbit of what she is about. She's the co-founder and executive director of Rights4Girls, an award-winning human rights attorney and advocate. Her work focuses on intersections of race, gender, violence, and the law. She is nationally recognized as an expert on gendered violence who has successfully advocated for several laws at the federal and state levels, testified before the U.S. Senate, state legislatures, and international human rights bodies, and co-authored several reports exposing widespread criminalization of girls who have survived violence. The mission of Rights4Girls is to advocate for the dignity and rights of young women and girls so that every girl can be safe and live a life free from violence, exploitation. And what I say to that, Yasmin, is amen. I'm going to repeat it. Amen. The website is Rights4Girls, a much needed nonprofit. Rights, the number 4, everybody, rights4girls.org. All the information will be in the body of this video. Welcome, Yasmin Vafa, back to the Warriors.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
I mean, absolutely. We haven't spoken for a minute, as we say in New York, and I said earlier, it is definitely time for updates, so let's go. But first, I want your reaction to 2 kind of breaking stories, if you don't mind. The first being the Kids Online Safety Act that just... Yeah. I think that's very exciting that, so tell us about that. What happened with the Kids Online Safety Act?
Yes, so this is really groundbreaking legislation, probably one of the most significant pieces of federal legislation we have seen on Capitol Hill in several years. It would really help to create really vital online protections for our nation's children by creating a duty of care where online platforms would have to enact certain standard protections to protect kids from certain types of content and really just protections that are much needed and that young people are telling us that they desperately seek. Today's New York Times actually had an article where so many young people, Gen Z, are saying that social media has harmed them and they actually wish certain platforms didn't even exist. Many of them, millions of them, in fact, are saying that they personally have been harmed by social media. And so our kids are really crying out for more regulation, more protections. And tech companies have shown us again and again that they're simply not willing to self-regulate. And so the Senate, really overwhelmingly passed the Kids Online Safety Act just last month in a vote of 91-3. And just this week, the House Energy and Commerce Committee passed KOSA, or the Kids Online Safety Act. And so now it moves to the House for a full vote. And so we're very hopeful that Speaker Johnson will bring it forward and really respond to what the nation, so many parents and so many young people are really calling out for. It's really time for us to act.
It's such wonderful news. And I want to point out also, it's bipartisan. Everybody's coming, yes, to this and saying, protect our children. So I think this is just terrific news. We all think it's terrific news. I just think, Yasmin, if this happens, I'm not going to say the if, when it happens, yes, I believe everything will snowball that's following behind it and we'll get the movement going. And the fact that children now and teens are speaking out about the platforms, I think it's the greatest thing that's happened, I don't know, ever maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had brave parents speaking out, parents who've lost their children to the harms of social media, predatory actors, who've extorted their children, just so many of these predatory platforms. And these parents have come together advocating just relentlessly on Capitol Hill, yes, sharing their stories, saying, not one more youth. And kids themselves have come and testified before Congress numerous numerous times advocating for more protections. And, many of them have said, we're sick of being the guinea pig generation. We have been seriously harmed from these lack of regulations, and it's time for more protections to be put in place. And, I urge folks to look at that New York Times piece. They have a number of graphics from surveys that they've done with young people that have shown, just how many of them say they've been harmed by certain platforms, certain apps in particular, and which ones have caused the most damage and what they actually would do for their own children. Many of them say they won't let their own kids have access to social media. So that tells you everything.
It tells us everything. And I'll put the link to that New York Times article in the body of this video so everybody can read. I posted it earlier. I was even, when I saw it, I'm like, wow,
yeah,
this is good. Everything's kind of bad, but this is really good. They're recognizing it. Now, Yasmin, I have to, because I'm in the middle of New York. I've been doing a lot of media. I have to tell you, I started in the music business right out of college. We've got to talk about what we called Pimp Daddy, not Puff Daddy, not P. Diddy, not PD, or not Love, as I learned recently in the paperwork. Give us your thoughts on that, because again, it's this power, wealth, taking advantage of vulnerable people. Give us your thoughts on this.
I think it's absolutely long overdue. We've heard rumblings, we've heard rumors for many, many years out of the music industry. We've heard, inklings about this for so long. And I think really this is a testament to the courage of survivors. And I think, we cannot stress enough the enormous courage and bravery of Cassie in coming forward with her story. It cannot have been easy, but we can't stress enough just the importance of, believing survivors the first time when they come forward. And, just if we could have believed her, the first time, how much of this could have been prevented. And, I think when one survivor comes forward, then the floodgates open, and that's what we're starting to see. And, I wouldn't be surprised if we see additional indictments come out after this and additional charges. The floodgates really open, because, things like this don't happen without many people knowing. And I think, it's clear that he had a lot of protection, like Harvey Weinstein, like R. Kelly, like Bill Cosby, and many other powerful men before them, like the Epsteins and Ghislaine Maxwell. There was many people who knew and protected him. And, I think we're going to see a lot of other names come forward. And I think, as the age of Me Too has really shown us, powerful individuals are not subject to impunity anymore. And there will be accountability for the harm done to survivors. And I think this is a powerful illustration of that. And so I hope that justice is swift, and I think of the survivors and hope for their healing.
Yes, I've been putting a focus on that and doing different, media work, because that part always gets forgotten, right?
Exactly.
I'm like, when I heard his lawyer talking about the conditions are, and I thought, oh my goodness, how about the conditions, the jails, the young women and reported minors were subjected to once they were at these freak offs. The whole thing makes you want to take a shower. We heard about it also for years. We do know women that tried to come forward here in New York. Nobody would believe them. Another common thing that happens, they didn't have monies for lawyers and things like that, so it gets brushed aside. We also had a lot of women who would not speak up. They told us that in the past, now we're talking years ago, I'm afraid for my own safety. I'm afraid for my family. They may have children now. Just let it go away. But I have to tell you, when they said, when the judge said no bail, I was so happy, because I thought the survivors could at least see this person is not going to be released. So it's a little something, and we'll keep our eye on it. But it is really just a disgusting example of really what happens to vulnerable people. That's what I'm trying to keep the eye on. We know that these freak off parties, we know from our work years ago, almost like casting calls. So it wasn't. So when I see sex workers and prostitutes It wasn't. It was also a lot of vulnerable young women who just thought, I'll be flown into town. I'll get a gorgeous outfit they're going to buy me. I'm going to be, in the music business, rubbing the elbows and having a party. They did not know, I am telling you, that this was going to go down to the extent it went down. And where are they today? Right?
Right. And
Lives.
just absolutely, exactly. And just absolutely predatory, right? And just luring and manipulating, these people in with the promises of, proximity to power, proximity to celebrity, and then just absolutely, it's serial rape from what we're hearing in these indictments and in all of the documents that have been released. I mean, this is serial rape on a mass scale and sex trafficking, and it's very, very serious what's being alleged. So and when you go back, you can see evidence of the violence and the coercion. There are photos of Cassie throughout the years where she has bruises all over her body, evidence of bruises. And people just shrugged it off. People just ignored it. And so, my hope is that this process can bring some hope and healing to the survivors and other survivors out there, that, there can be some accountability and there can be some justice. And even the most powerful perpetrators can, face accountability.
Yeah. And you know what, Yasmin? I hope they give him, I hear the food's really bad. I hope he gets food poisoning with a bad tuna fish sandwich. That's just me. You don't have to comment on that. I'm just going to throw that out there after inflicting all this, and his organized crime circle, it seems, also. I just can't believe people really, I know people sell out for $1, but witnessing this, right? And his chief of staff was a woman, his closest ally, and seeing women and girls abused like this. But we'll keep our eye on it. And as we go along, I'd love your opinion on everything. But again, it's this wealth and power over vulnerable people. Now, let's talk about, I'm throwing a lot of things at you, but I had this encounter yesterday where somebody kept saying, child prostitute to me, child prostitute. And then I finally just corrected them because I try to be respectful, Yasmin. But I thought back to my Rights4Girls and everything I've learned. So would you please just review that with us? Because I don't think 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls can be prostitutes. What do you have to say?
Oh, well, we are very clear on this. We have a whole campaign that we launched together with a survivor, actually, T. Ortiz, who's a brilliant and inspiring, activist and leader in her own right, called "There Is No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute," right, precisely because minors who are under the age of 18 cannot consent to sex, let alone commercial sex. And under our federal laws, any minor under the age of 18 who's engaged in the commercial sex trade is by definition a victim of human trafficking. And so our laws are very clear. There does not need to be any showing of force, fraud, or coercion in order to constitute trafficking. There does not need to be a monetary exchange. Commercial sex act under our law is defined as the exchange of any sex act for anything of value. And there does not need to be a third-party exploiter. So, situations that are sometimes called survival sex, where you have very vulnerable children exchanging sex with adults in order to meet their basic needs, sex in exchange for shelter, sex in exchange for, clothing or drugs or food. All of that constitutes child sex trafficking under our laws. And so people who use that language, we point out that is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as a child prostitute, a child sex worker, an underage prostitute. This language is contrary to federal law, most state laws, international law, and simply is a form of victim blaming. And, we work really hard to shift our language and our laws so that we, no longer put that type of blame on child victims.
Yasmin, now I consider you our legal warrior. Please explain. I'm a little confused about all of this. The justice system right now, the landscape, especially for our girls of color. You do extensive work in that area. And I'm not exactly sure, when I pulled up a map of yours, in the following states, at least 80% of youth serving life sentences are Black. And we have Alabama and Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Maryland. What's going on here?
Yeah. So, the United States is one of the only countries in the world that allows children to be sentenced as adults. And actually, many of these children can die behind bars. And, I think it's a really damning indictment of how cruel our justice system can be. A lot of these children, especially girls, from our research, we know that sexual violence and sexual abuse is a primary predictor of justice involvement in girls. So we've done a lot of research on this. Our first report on this issue was called the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline. Last year, we did an update on that report called Criminalized Survivors, Today's Abuse to Prison Pipeline with Georgetown Law Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity to really re-examine what was happening to our girls. And, we found that this issue predominantly affects girls of color, African-American, Indigenous, Latina girls in particular. And what typically happens is when girls who, suffer from different forms of adversity experience sexual abuse, trafficking, exploitation, they often don't have the same protective factors as girls with economic stability, family stability to heal from that type of trauma. And so these marginalized girls often have to resort to fending for themselves in order to cope with that harm and that trauma. And so the common responses to abuse and trauma are then criminalized by our system. So things like running away. Many survivors of abuse, if you're being raped by your stepdad or in your foster care placement, your response is going to be to run away from home. That's an arrestable offense. Sometimes these survivors are trafficking victims, and so they can be arrested for prostitution or offenses related to that. Many trafficking survivors are subject to what's called forced criminality. Traffickers have figured out that they can make a lot of money by forcing young trafficking survivors to commit armed robbery, kidnapping, recruiting other children into trafficking. We are working with survivors right now that have very serious federal charges, things like money laundering, wire fraud, all types of other very serious charges. And, we have to educate judges, prosecutors, and others on this dynamic because they wouldn't otherwise know. And in some of the more egregious cases, we have survivors of child sex trafficking who are forced to commit acts of violence in attempts to escape their traffickers or in acts of self-defense. And in these cases, these young girls are sentenced and tried as adults and pushed into the adult criminal justice system for decades, sometimes even life behind bars. And usually these are young girls of color. We just recently saw an instance of this with Crystal Kaiser, a young girl out of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Crystal was 16 years old when she was first purchased off of an online website by an adult male who was 33 years old. He, unbeknownst to her, was trafficking and exploiting other young Black girls in the community and making videos of his sexual abuse of these young girls. He happened to be known by police to be exploiting these other girls. And when police raided his home, they found hundreds of videos of him exploiting other girls, including Crystal. Yet they didn't take him into custody. They didn't prosecute him. And so ultimately, Crystal ended up shooting and killing him. And she was charged with intentional homicide, charged as an adult, and was facing life in prison. She ended up taking a plea deal and just last month was sentenced to 11 years in adult prison. And so these are the types of cases we're seeing where, a lot of these child victims, oftentimes, our work centers on girls, but many of these children come from histories of trauma, from system involvement, foster care youth, and they suffer from what are known as implicit biases. So there's been a ton of research recently that's come out around the concept of adultification bias. The Georgetown Law Center that I mentioned did this excellent report where they surveyed how adults respond to young Black girls in particular, where they perceive them as much older and less innocent than their white peers. So, for example, they put out survey and questioned a number of adults throughout the country, and they ultimately found that starting from ages 5 to 9, adults perceived young Black girls as less innocent, more independent, less in need of comfort and nurturing than their white peers, and even more knowledgeable about things like sex. And so this in turn means, and studies have subsequently shown, that when young Black girls experience things like sexual abuse, they're seen as more responsible for that abuse and complicit in that abuse. And so they're not seen as victims of crime. They're not even seen as children. And so this in turn really shapes their outcomes in the justice system. And so we do a lot of training around these types of implicit biases with judges, because the reality is it's implicit, it's unconscious. And so we all need to be mindful of these types of biases in our everyday work, especially those of us who work with children in these systems. And so that's why we see some of these glaring disparities in the justice system and across these states.
I mean, I have to ask you, Yasmin, I mean, with your studies, I'm haunted. I'm not kidding. The sexual abuse to prison pipeline, you know, all of that, right? And all of your studies, the information is there. The studies are there. The facts are there. Why is it so hard? Is it just a matter of training law enforcement, training the judges, enacting new legislation? Like, why? Because in the meantime, so many more girls are being thrown into this and victimized. And why can't we change it quicker? I know it's kind of a loaded question, but it's like, it's so blatant.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, right? A lot of these issues stem in child sexual abuse, gender-based violence, rape culture, right? A lot of these issues are just deeply entrenched. And gender-based violence is deeply entrenched. I mean, the CDC recently released their stats around teen girls and how teen girls in the United States are really struggling. You know, me, myself, you know, I'm Middle Eastern, and, you know, I always find it fascinating that we talk about, you know, how women and girls are treated in other parts of the world and the rates of gender violence in other parts of the world. And then coming here, realizing that our rates of gender-based violence are just as staggering as many parts of the developing world. And we really need to address it here. And the CDC recently found that, you know, 1 in 5 American girls experiences sexual violence. 1 in 10 American girls, teen girls, has been raped. That, you know, teen girls are, you know, are more sad and hopeless than they've been in over a decade. Many of them experience, you know, depression and suicidal ideation, some of the highest rates that we've seen in over a decade. And, you know, I think all of that ties together. And I think, you know, we really need to examine the impact of rape culture, the impact of, you know, porn culture, and how it impacts the lives of young women and children in our society. And we really need to just be doing more to protect our children and towards prevention. I think our children are really begging us to really step up here.
I mean, as evidenced, even to digress a little bit, by the New York Times, the article where they're like, we realize, like, we've been victims. We want some, you know, kids want focus. Kids want structure.
Exactly.
If you look at studies, even though, you know, teens can be a little difficult or whatever. No, because we do plenty of work behind the scenes with a lot of kids. And once you get them over that hurdle, they like it. They like structure. And I'm talking, you know, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Let me ask you, what is on your mind right now that you want to speak about, you want the public to know? There's just so many things for them to absorb. And the other thing, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'm trying, Yasmin, maybe you have a suggestion here. We talk to each other. I'm really trying hard with the Warriors to take all of this information out into the public. Like, we need the public. We can't keep talking to, I don't mean you, I mean generally, right? Like, we have to get it into the public's hands, because I can't tell you, in the middle of New York City, I explain these things, I show studies, facts, and people are like, that's not happening. What are you talking about? I never heard of it. So tell us right now, how should we handle that? Except keep talking about it and educating people.
Right.
I don't know what else to do.
I think these are just difficult subjects. And, at a time where we as a nation are just dealing with so much, I think it's hard for people to deal with one more difficult subject. But the reality is that, it's impacting so many people, and it's happening in all of our communities. And, to your question about what am I thinking about? One of the biggest challenges that we have been facing in the last several years is this growing movement to fully decriminalize the sex trade. We've been working on issues of child sex trafficking, the overcriminalization of young girls, and all of that is related to this issue. We have worked at the intersection of justice reform, gender-based violence, sex trafficking, and people have always said, well, we don't work on prostitution. That doesn't tie into any of those issues. And what folks don't understand is it absolutely does, because if we were to fully decriminalize prostitution, it increases sex trafficking. And that in turn is a key driver of juvenile justice involvement in girls and other youth. It hugely increases child sex trafficking, which creates vulnerabilities. It draws in more vulnerable women and girls and LGBTQ youth and other, foster youth and other vulnerable people from our communities, and, essentially gives a free pass to these, perpetrators that we talked about, sex buyers, exploiters, traffickers, brothel owners, and really creates a culture of impunity. It's very counter to everything we've been talking about in terms of creating more community accountability and believing survivors and ending this type of, rape culture that, we've been saying is so harmful. And so that's one of the biggest challenges we've been facing. People think that it's very progressive, but unfortunately, we've been trying to counteract that mentality and show folks that it's actually incredibly regressive and will create enormous harm to some of our most marginalized youth and communities.
All I can say, because the question I always do get talking about this is why? And I say it makes a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
makes, it's a bad answer. That is really what I think it trickles down to. There's so much money to be made. And the other thing we rarely talk about is the demand part of it.
Right.
This demand coming, it's all over. And if we have this open everything, people will try this that may not, right? Engage in this type of behavior, thinking nothing will happen to them. We know supply and demand. To me, it's very easy to you, right? It increases everything. I just call it a big wheel with a lot of spokes. Like everything's related, making the wheel go, because I try so hard, Yasmin, to like explain it to them when they fight me and say like, my body empowerment. I say your body
No.
empowerment.
Yeah.
Like that is no. Education is empowerment. Getting a job is empowerment. Helping your community is empowerment. Helping, younger girls, if you're a little bit older, that's empowerment. Like, really?
If it was so empowering, why don't we see, why is it the least empowered people, who are the most represented in this industry? If it was so empowering, we would see the most empowered people, right? Successful, highly privileged people, engaged in this. And that's just not the case. It's always the most marginalized people, people who have histories of childhood sexual abuse, incest, system involvement. Many of them come from foster care. Most of them have histories of childhood sexual abuse and incredible trauma. That is the vast majority of individuals in the sex trade. Most of them were the child sex trafficking victims of yesterday who've just come of age in the industry. And so it's really important for people to understand that. And as you said, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, which means they have lobbyists, they have, communication specialists, they have, media specialists. And that means that they have a vested interest in becoming legitimate and becoming legal. And so that's important for people to realize, just like big tech, just like, tobacco, there's a whole machine behind this. And it's important for people to realize that. And that's something I think folks miss a lot.
A lot. They miss it. I was up in Albany just a few months ago, a lot of us from New York, and I will say they are, full decrim, like they are organized. They come in busloads. They come with boxed lunches. They come,
Yeah.
and, noise. But I always say, well, we have facts and truth on our side. And if we present that, you can drown out all that loud noise kind of thing, yelling and screaming and things like that. And you know what, though? It is, pendulum is swinging back. I feel it. Do you feel that way? Because I feel more people are definitely on board. They're discussing it. Parents and caretakers are waking up. Younger people, as evidenced again by the New York Times article, what young people want. What are your feelings on that as we finish up? Because we are hopeful. This cannot sustain the way it is. There's a lot of noise around good things. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think young people for sure are waking up to, become more thoughtful around these issues. I definitely think they're starting to question, the concepts around what liberal feminism and, what has been labeled, porn friendly feminism and all of that Playboy feminism, as others have dubbed it, and really starting to question if your feminism aligns with some of the biggest misogynists in society, perhaps we need to re-examine our feminism. And I think, today's Gen Z are being much more thoughtful and thinking critically about some of those messages they're being force fed through the media and through some of the, mouthpieces for the sex industry. So I am very hopeful. And, I think we've been very successful in getting the word out about this well-funded effort. I mean, we've seen these full decriminalization bills and ballot initiatives in over a dozen states. And I think, now legislators are starting to realize, like, this isn't a joke. This isn't just a couple of progressive radical states. This is like Louisiana. This is like, all over the place. We've seen it in places like, Michigan, Oregon, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, California, all over the country. I mean, dozens. Like I'm, my mind is blinking, but there have been so many different bills and ballot initiatives that have popped up in the last 2-3 years. And it's very well coordinated and funded and organized. And so I think people are starting to realize how grassroots is this, who stands to benefit. And, I have to shout out the survivor movement, because they have just been incredibly, powerful in their stance of saying absolutely not. We need survivor-centered sex trade reform that centers what we need, which is services and support to exit this industry. And I think that has been incredibly powerful and inspiring.
Yeah, I agree. We have to remind everybody we always want to listen to the survivor's story. We want to support the survivors, empower them, because they make our jobs, I don't want to say easier, but it's their experiences help us shape everything we do. I do a lot of work here in New York with a lot of survivors, and we're doing, we just started a lot of holistic, I saw this kind of whole, like we talk in New York, holistic helps healing. But I didn't see any of it, Yasmin. So I started a collaboration with an art studio. I have some dancer friends from Broadway. They're going to be offering classes, just movement, like, and we started our first, I'm pointing this out because it was such a powerful thing for me just a few weeks ago. We did our first art studio down in Soho. And after 4.5 hours, I had to kick them out. It was supposed to be a 2-hour on a Sunday afternoon, just to paint, listen to disco music or whatever music they wanted. But luckily for me, they wanted disco music. And yes. And food, and just paint and have a release.
Yeah.
And it was the most beautiful thing just to see a group of women just breathe for a couple of hours and just end up laughing. You know, it was quiet in the beginning and then just laugh by the end and never wanting to leave, you know, and they went home with a piece of art. So I see so many great positive things. And I want to urge everybody, rights4girls.org is the website. Again, everything will be in the body of the video. I want to urge everybody to also, I'm going to throw this out there, just once a week. Don't buy that $6 or $8 cup of coffee. I don't know. Some of them are 10 here in New York, Yasmin. Save that money and take it times 4 for your month and send it to Rights for Girls. Empower this wonderful organization. Empower the great research and work that Yasmin and her team are doing, because this is the work that truly matters, supporting girls, supporting women, and talking about it. So Yasmin Vafa, your work is without peer. We want to thank you. You are such a warrior. I enjoy talking to you, but let us speak again soon, more often, so we can keep on top of these issues. We can share with the public what is happening, because they need to know and they need to hear it from you.
Thank you. I'd love that.
Thanks, Jasmine. We'll talk again soon.
Bye. Thank you.